Hey, it's Mike here, and today the research on why a zero coronary artery calcium score is not a get out of heart disease free card, and it absolutely doesn't mean that you're immune to getting heart disease in the future. And I had to cover this because over and over again, I'm seeing carnivore dieters or low carbers holding up a score of 0 and saying, oh look, my heart attack risk is low. And of course, I absolutely do not have heart disease, but of course you can still have a high heart disease risk and even have active heart disease with a score of 0. Research we'll cover soon. But since most people don't know the information we're about to cover in this video, when people are promoting their carnivore diet, for example, people are watching it, you know, their eyes shiny. Wow, it looks like you're immune to heart disease. You don't have it, even though your LDL is 200 plus. Anyway, let's go. Lightning fast, I just want to mention that the Costa Rica trip happens to have one opening. Unfortunately, it's just limited to a guy because they're sharing a room with a guy. If you are interested in that, the link for the waitlist will be below. If it's not there anymore, assume it's filled. Moving on. What is a coronary artery calcium score? Well, from the Mayo Clinic, simply put, coronary calcium scan is a special CT scan of the heart. It looks for calcium deposits in the heart arteries. And a higher score is obviously associated with a higher risk of heart disease. I'm not arguing that, especially because a score over 100, for example, is showing that you do have artery clogging. It is heart disease. I think the first time I saw the 0 score thrown out there was by Sean Baker, carnivore dieter, and somebody commented, oh, but Sean has a coronary artery calcium score of 0, therefore he's perfect and immune to all heart disease. And with a quick search, I found about 10 comments on my channel alone about Sean's 0 CAC score, so he's spreading this idea far and wide. And former carnivore dieter Paul Saladino also got a 0 CAC score after 2 years on a carnivore diet, which he used to defend his LDL of over 500.
My most recent LDL was very high. It was 533 milligrams per deciliter.
What's normal?
Less than 100 or around 100.
So 100 is preferred? Or
preferred by the mainstream cardiologist, right?
Okay.
You know, it's done a lot of damage, but thankfully he has quit, he says.
In my own life, doing a carnivore diet of meat, organs, and fat and salt for a year and a half that, including carbohydrates in my diet, improved my health from there. I was getting such bad muscle cramps, heart palpitations, sleep disturbances. My testosterone was kind of going down.
Can these people reach 0 because of the magic of their carnivore diet, that despite having super high levels of LDL, their arteries just don't clog, even though LDL is causal to atherosclerosis? Well, a lot of it has to do with just how they're not elderly. This is the one point I've covered before. We have so many new points though. Multiple data sets show that at around the age of 50, half of people have a score of 0, even while eating, you know, the standard American diet. We have this one from a scanning clinic. Averaging men and women out is about 50. And then I've never mentioned this study before from this chart. Again, 50% at around the age of 50. But if the idea that the vast majority of people that are in their 50s or younger can just say, here's my coronary artery calcium score of 0, follow whatever diet I'm promoting is not a legitimate idea, then we have a bunch more information we're about to get into. We have, first of all, from MedPage, they say that a coronary artery calcium score of 0 is not a clean bill of health. So at least it's not just a vegan telling you, it's the opinion of other people as well. And they do mention a study. They say, the Western Denmark Heart Registry of over 23,000 people who had symptoms suggestive of coronary artery disease and underwent CT angiography had a rate of about 54% of people with a 0 coronary artery calcium score, despite being up around 58 years old. Okay, but that was symptoms suggestive of artery disease, doesn't mean they actually had it, so maybe that inflated that data a little bit. Well, do we have any more concrete studies? Did anybody say scan some just average people with a score of 0 and see what their plaque levels were? Well, yes, we have this Brazilian study which means they were likely healthier than your average American, and average age of about 50. They say, quote, the frequency of atherosclerotic plaque with 0 coronary artery calcium score was relatively high, indicating that the absence of calcification does not exclude the presence of plaques, many of which obstructive. To be fair, that was about 10% of the population they looked at. Probably healthier than the US again. And 40% of those people had significant coronary obstructions of greater than 50% blockage. So that's pretty huge for a 0 score. Next, this American Heart Association paper poses the question, well, 0 is desirable, is it enough? It looked at cardiovascular disease events, which includes heart attacks, and perhaps the most important point here is, quote, about 1/4 to 1/3 of the total incident cardiovascular disease events occur in those with a coronary artery calcium score of 0. How is this even possible? Well, of course, as many of you know, there are hard calcified plaques, and then there are also soft plaques. Many lines of reasoning say that soft plaques are more unstable. We'll get into that in a little bit. But it's likely that there are cases where people have gone on a carnivore diet, skyrocketed their LDL, and ended up with these soft plaques and actually gotten a coronary artery calcium score of 0 and been like, I'm all good. Next, we have this study, which does cover the age issue. But first, they looked at about 1,000 people, and they found obstructive CAD in 17 out of 76 patients with a coronary artery calcium score of 0. So yeah, we're looking at like a 20% rate there. 4 of those people suffered cardiovascular events within 30 days. And to age, the authors found that patients under 50 were 70% more likely to have obstructive coronary artery disease with a coronary artery calcium score of 0. And next up, we have another study that looks at the age issue and also has a pretty compelling case study. First, their age point is that, quote, relative to older patients, most coronary plaque in younger patients with coronary artery disease is non-calcified most plaque. They go as far as to say that coronary artery calcium score of 0 does not reliably exclude obstructive heart disease in patients under 40. And they illustrate all of this with a case study of a 31-year-old with 2 obstructed arteries despite a coronary artery calcium score of 0. We can look to this picture. Yeah, that lower anterior descending artery and proximal first obtuse marginal are just totally blocked. Fully clogged arteries, no calcium to be seen. And his cholesterol was really, really low, actually. Nope, it wasn't. His total cholesterol was 364, you know, a pretty normal carnivore number. Though it doesn't say what diet he ate, and there is another pretty compelling case study from Heart Care Sydney in Australia, a 37-year-old with a 0 score again, but look at that blockage. Ouchie, ouch, oucherson. Or should I say nar, because they're Australian. And of course, it is worth mentioning a couple cases on a carnivore diet. You know, they weren't coronary artery calcium scored, but we have this Alzheimer's Forum guy. He was like, hey, I've had 2 heart attacks on a carnivore diet year after year. One, you know, a blocked artery, and at that point, his right coronary artery was only at 10% blocked, and then the next year it was 99% blocked. Of course he quit because that's quite dramatic. And then we have the carnivore kid who said his widowmaker artery, also LAD, was blocked at 95%, and he was like, screw this, I've been so healthy. And we have case studies in the literature of younger carnivore diets, both around 30, having horribly clogged arteries, 90th and 97th percentile. It's also funny how these carnivore and low carbers are so into the coronary artery calcium score and just vehemently deny LDL and its bad effects because they have really high levels of LDL, of course, but from studies like this, LDL is a marker that predicts coronary artery calcium. And of course it does, because LDL leads to plaques, and those plaques can accumulate calcium. So this is, you know, hand in hand. And it is also worth mentioning from that study that particularly powerful of a marker was the LDL to HDL ratio, which brings me back to the steak and butter gal, or Bella, on the carnivore diet that I recently covered. And she had her vegan versus non-vegan numbers, and I calculated her ratio. And originally on a vegan diet, her ratio, not a Mexican guy, we're talking about her ratio with levels 81 LDL and 73 HDL was at 1.1. And then on a carnivore diet, LDL of 264, HDL of 98 was 2.7 for that final ratio, over doubled, so that risk would just go way up for coronary artery calcification in the future. But of course, she's what, like in her 30s, so she's probably gonna have a 0 score for a while, but it is likely that her score is not going to remain at 0 for as long as it otherwise would because of her high LDL. And carnivore is a low carb type of diet, and this video of mine 2 years ago which makes me tempted to cut my hair, covers a study looking at higher versus lower carb diets and coronary artery calcium score over 8 years. So they got a baseline measurement of the coronary artery calcium score, and then on average, about 8.5 years later, they got a second follow-up score, and they did that for about 2,200 people, so there's definitely a lot of data there. And here's a chart from the study showing stepwise, bam, the more carbs, the lower progression they saw on the coronary artery calcium score. Interesting stuff. And I will say the result was more dramatic until they adjusted for a bunch of those factors. Some of them I think they absolutely did need to adjust for, some of them not quite as much. They adjusted for a ton, and we're talking ones that I don't think they should have adjusted for as much, including LDL cholesterol. And recently I did see it covered by carnivore cardiologist Dr. Ovadia reviewing the results of a carnivore dieter. And that's this guy, Raymond, an example of somebody who had a high CAC score on a carnivore diet, 98th percentile, though he was just carnivore for a year then. He was low carb, it appears, for about 3 years before that.
He had what would be considered a high score for a 46-year-old. So his total score was 731. And that put him in the 98th percentile, they said, for his age group. Was the damage done prior to them starting, the dietary changes?
But he says people with a high CAC score could just be doing carnivore wrong. Okay.
Was it done, from carnivore low carb, which is always a concern, especially amongst uninformed practitioners?
His follow-up score rose 120 points, which to me is like, oh geez. But, Ovadia thinks it's a win because now he's just in the 90th percentile.
So, now we fast forward to 2023, and Raymond's repeat scan shows that his score has gone up some, 854, but now he's in the 90th percentile as opposed to the 98th percentile previously, which means, compared to sort of his comparison group, he's actually had some improvement.
But this is just a case showing that coronary artery calcium scores do rise on a carnivore diet. He didn't stop it. Carnivores are not immune. And this is where I wanted to get into a little bit more about soft plaques versus hard plaques, because there was just some information I stumbled upon that I thought was interesting that you might want to know. And first of all, you've probably heard that soft plaques are more dangerous because they're more unstable and susceptible to rupturing and causing blockages than those calcified plaques. And from Harvard, they say that, quote, doctors especially want to target the softer plaques before they rupture compared to harder plaques. But we do have some newer studies showing that, hey, the more calcification we're seeing in the arteries, the more risk there is of rupturing. But this could be picking up on just the differences, the unique types of calcified plaques. For example, more calcification picked up could represent more like spotty calcification across more plaque sites that are, not that stable still, but then can rupture. But then you have some super dense calcium-packed plaques that are just not going anywhere. So it's a nuanced issue. That being said, I was wondering, what is the actual ratio that we tend to see between hard and soft plaques in people's arteries? And it appears that also varied. We have this study on people that are about 70-year-old on average, and they separated it out by people who had strokes and transient blockages versus people that didn't. And this is really interesting because the people that didn't have these blockages actually had a much higher ratio of soft to hard plaques. They had significantly more hard than soft, but then when you get to the people who did have these strokes and other issues, the amount of soft outweighs the amount of hard plaque by like 3 times. So they're like the opposite. Very interesting, and does support the idea that these soft plaques are likely gonna rupture compared to the hard ones. And back to that Harvard article on keeping your coronary artery calcium score down, they say, quote, "The key is lowering LDL and making lifestyle changes." Yeah, once again, LDL levels are regularly twice the cutoff for optimal that is conventionally set on a carnivore diet. So yeah, all signs point to lowering your LDL being more beneficial. Of course, I have to mention that vegans have drastically lower LDL on average. Looking to 2 pounds of steak, the only real advantage they might have here is that they're dismally devoid of calcium in their diet on a carnivore diet, like 20%. So yeah, a few carnivore creators online having a coronary artery calcium score of 0 in no way means that that diet is heart healthy. It mainly just means that they are not elderly. It also is the case that you can have, again, severe heart disease with a coronary artery calcium score of 0. And I do feel like that could be more likely when you're slamming your LDL up so high that you would have these fast plaques that don't have enough time to accumulate calcium. And also add in how having a high LDL would increase your risk is predictive of having a higher coronary artery calcium score. Not looking good. And that's perhaps the main point with heart disease being our leading killer. We have to realize that heart disease is a disease that progresses over decades. So you can kind of get away with a lot, especially when you're younger in terms of making claims about artery health. You know, we have that CT scan in that carnivore who's 20 and it's like, oh, carnivore diets are perfect. But no, we have to be hedging our bets by lowering all of our risk factors as much as possible. So we have a lower risk of getting heart disease in the future, obviously. All right, let me know down below what you think about all of this, any points I missed about coronary artery calcium, etc. And of course, feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I should also mention that my rate of viewers that are subscribed is apparently drastically lower than the YouTube average. So if you want to help me out, feel free to do that. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.